Welcome back, everyone. For today's video, we are going to be taking a look at the fifth round of the Tata Steel chess tournament, which is being held in the city of Vikonsé in the country of the Netherlands. Now, on a completely different note, today it was announced that Norway chess will be happening in May of 2024, and you're probably wondering, why am I bringing that up? Now, the reason I bring Norway chess up is that one of the big surprises about the upcoming edition of the event is that there will be a men's section featuring 6 top players in the world, including yours truly, the famous streamer Hikaru Nakamura, but alongside that, there will also be a women's edition featuring 6 of the top female players as well. So on that note, back to Tata Steel. Now, one of the great things about this event being held in Tata Steel is that there are many players of different rating ranges. There are also some top female players who are competing, and the first game we're going to be taking a look at is from the master section, a game between Wenjun, the current women's world champion, and Alireza Firouzja from France, who recently qualified for the candidates tournament. So without further ado, let's jump right into the action. Now, Wenjun has had a very tough start. She lost 2 games with the white pieces from very promising positions against Jordan van Forest and Anish Giri, both from the Netherlands, but today might be a little bit different. So Wenjun starts out with the move d4, Alireza plays e6, and now we get e4. Now, one of the interesting things is when Alireza plays e6 on move 1, he's essentially disrespecting Zhu from the standpoint that normally Alireza would probably play the move knight f6, c4, and e6 here. But when Alireza plays move 1 e6, he gives Wenjun the choice to either play c4 or play e4. Now, it is my strong belief that if Wenjun had played c4, Alireza would not have played knight f6 here. He might have played c5, might have played d5, or perhaps even the move b6 on move 2. But Wenjun decides instead to play e4 here and go into a French instead, deciding to show her versatility of playing both d4 and e4 on move number 1. So Alireza plays d5. Now we get the move e takes d5, e takes d5, and this move knight f3. While the exchange French is generally considered to be pretty dry and boring, one of the big upsides here is that Wenjun being outrated by Alireza by more than 200 points, Alireza feels the need to try and win this game, try to do something to spice it up. And in many cases, when you're playing someone who's much higher rated, this is an optimal strategy because if you play something that's very boring, they tend to take more risks and they can make some mistakes along the way. So Alireza plays bishop d6, we get the move c4, now we have knight to f6, and here Wenjun plays this move c5. Now we get bishop to e7 from Alireza. We get the move bishop to d3, castles, castles, and bishop g4. While black's bishop has been kicked away from this very nice diagonal from d6 towards the pawn on h2, white's pawns here look a little bit overextended. Black can play b6 to try and chip away at the pawn center. You could also go knight c6 and try to win the pawn on d4 as well. So here we get h3, Alireza goes bishop h5, trying to keep the pin of the bishop towards the knight on f3 and the queen on d1. Wenjun plays bishop to e3, and now we have the move knight c6 being played. Here knight bd2 is played so that now white can recapture with the knight on f3. Alireza plays rook to e8, and here Wenjun plays the move bishop b5. Now, much like her 2 previous games against Jordan van Forest and Anish Giri, you can tell that out of the opening she has a very, very good position. Not a huge advantage, but a fairly stable one. And it's very clear to me that all these male players that she's faced so far, they're trying to create imbalances, and they're hoping that in the long run, even if they're a little bit worse early on, they can outplay her. So we get knight e4 from Alireza here. Since Wenjun moved the bishop away, he plays knight e4 with the idea of potentially f5 here to over support the knight on e4, or maybe bishop f6 to put even more pressure on the pawn on d4. So Wenjun goes queen a4, we get the move knight takes d2, knight takes knight, now we have bishop g5, and here Wenjun plays bishop takes knight. We get another exchange on c6, and now rook e1 is played. We get takes, 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 and here queen e8 is played. Now you'll probably notice the bar has gone down quite a bit, but one great thing about this position for Wenjun, and this comes back to the whole psychology of when you're playing someone much lower rated or higher rated, is that here, even though Wenjun doesn't have a big advantage anymore, the position is very, very stable. Alireza does not have a lot of chance to create counterplay and win this game. The reason for that, he has these double pawns on c6. There's no real break in the center of the board. White actually is the one who can decide to play e4 or not play e4 at all, and for that reason, it's very hard to win the game. So Wenjun plays rook to e1 here, guarding the pawn on e3. We get f5 here from Alireza. Maybe f4 is an idea, maybe queen g6 as well, to try and put pressure on the g file. Wenjun goes queen a6 here, trying to put pressure on c6 further, but also maybe infiltrate with the queen b7 move. And more importantly, you can always bring this queen back to either d3 or to f1 at the same time. So game continues with f4. Of course, Alireza trying to create an imbalance here, We get queen to f1, takes, and now Wenjun plays queen d3 here. Temporarily, she's down a pawn, but because of this pin on the e file, black really can't save the pawn. If black were to take the knight, you take the queen, checking the king, and after rook takes rook, queen takes pawn, the queen will definitely win against the rook and the bishop due to all these weak pawns on the queen side, which will be captured by the valiant queen. So Alireza goes e2, Wenjun plays knight f3, and now Alireza makes an epic blunder here with this move queen f7. Now probably what happened here for Alireza is he realized that at this point in the game he probably can't win anymore. If he were to play a move like bishop f3, for example, after queen takes f3, a5, rook takes e2, and queen f7, takes, the game is petering out here into a rook and pawn endgame, and most likely it will be a draw. Now, because Alireza doesn't want to draw the game, he's outranking his opponent by 200 points. He's having a good event. If he can win this game, he might even be able to take the lead in the tournament. He decides to sort of go on autopilot here and play this move queen f7. Probably what Alireza expected was rook takes pawn, and after bishop takes knight, queen takes bishop, queen takes queen, pawn takes, and king f7. Again, the game should be a draw. White has no entries on the e file. Black can always go rook to e8 later on and go into the king and pawn endgame, so there are no worries whatsoever. However, queen to f7 is a big mistake because now Wenjun correctly plays knight g5, forking the queen on f7 as well as the pawn on h7, and now Alireza has to play queen g6. If you were to play queen f6, I take the pawn on h7, I snap the bishop on h5, and suddenly white is winning the game. So Alireza goes queen g6, we get queen takes queen, and now regrettably he has to take with the bishop. Alireza would love to take with the pawn and keep the defense of the e2 pawn alive, but after g4 the bishop is simply trapped on the edge of the board and white will win in short order. So we get bishop takes g6, rook takes e2. Now we have even material, but black is actually technically lost here. And the reason for that is this light square bishop cannot touch any of the white pawns here. You'll notice these pawns are on the opposite color of the bishop. And on top of that, black has double pawns here. But most importantly, white can reroute the knight to e5 here with this great bastion, and black has zero counterplay whatsoever. So Alireza plays h6. Now we get the move knight to f3. We have bishop e4, knight to e5 played here. Great bastion. Pawn on c6 is going to fall here, and it's looking very, very dire for Alireza indeed. So he plays a5. We get knight takes pawn. He goes a4. Wenjun plays rook to e3. He goes rook to a6, and now we have this move knight to b4. Now the computer really likes knight e5 more than knight b4, and the reason is quite simple. Knight stops this rook from swinging over to g6, where it can target the pawn on g2, but additionally, down the road, white is going to be able to give up a pawn on the queen side and get a big advantage. And the reason is if black goes rook 8, and this is probably why Wenjun did not play this, after rook a3, rook b8, b3 here, pawn takes, white can take back here. I believe with the pawn, rook takes maybe is okay. And if black goes bishop c2, you go rook a7, and after rook b3, rook c7, and bishop to e4 here, white simply can play rook to c8, king to h7, rook to f8, and the idea is if black goes rook f2 or rook b2, you have rook f2 here, stopping any threats on the second rank, and otherwise the knight is just supporting the c pawn going up the board. Bishop again is not really in the game. There's one target on g2, but the bishop can't really stop this pawn. This knight is forever glued to the e5 square, and white is simply winning. So this would have been better for Wenjun to play, but it's also very hard to be super critical, because one thing that players have to, or one thing that you guys have to keep in mind, is when players are playing in a tournament and they're struggling, if they lose a game or two, they had much better positions, or just in general, if they lose a game or two, your confidence is a little bit shaky and you're not as sure of yourself as you normally would be. And for Wenjun here, she probably thought, well, if I go knight e5 and you get some rook 8, rook b8, get some counterplay, maybe something will go wrong. I think if this were a clean slate start of the tournament, very likely she would play knight e5 here, but because she's lost a couple of games, her confidence is probably shaken a little bit. She decides to play knight b4 instead. Now Alireza plays rook g6. Rook a8 here would not be very effective, because after, say, rook c3, for example, rook b8 and a3, white can always plant this knight on b4, or even go rook to a3 here, followed by b3 as well, to try and win this pawn on a4. So Alireza goes rook g6, we get g3, now we have h5, rook a3, king f8 is played here. White cannot capture the pawn on a4 without losing this pawn on g3, so Wenjun goes king f2. Alireza plays the check, king e2, and now he goes back to the g6 square, trying to always keep some pressure on this pawn on g3. So here Wenjun plays h4, a very thematic move, not the best move by the way, but very thematic. And once again, what Wenjun is trying to do here is put all these pawns on the opposite color of this light square bishop. Black has what looks like a very nice wooden shield, but the bishop has no targets whatsoever, and probably she was also a little bit worried that if you were to play like rook c3, h4, g4, for example, now after rook f6, there's always an idea with bishop g2, and black here, for example, can get this situation. I'll just set it up so you guys see it, something like this, for example, where these pawns that white has on the king side are on the same color as the bishop, and so it's very, very hard for white to win the game now. So she plays h4. Now we get king e8 from Alireza. We have rook e3 back, king d7, and now she plays a3. Here Alireza goes rook to e6, and now we get this move, king to d2. Computer actually thinks rook to e6 is a serious mistake because white could try to reroute the horse now to a2 and c3, and after rook g6 and knight c3, now there's a lot of pressure towards the bishop and the pawn here on e4 and d5, both under attack. Pawn on a4 is under attack as well, and it's very, very difficult to play. Instead, we get king to d2, rook f6, king e2, rook f8, and now Wenjun plays b3. Now this is also very logical here because what Wenjun wants to do after takes is create the outside a pawn. Now again, this bishop looks really nice on e4, but it does not cover any of the squares on the diagonal, so if white can just push this pawn all the way up the board, white probably is going to win the game. So we have bishop g2. Now we get rook to e3, not a4 here, by the way, because now I think there's bishop to f1, and after king d2, bishop c4. While white is so much better after rook to e3, it looks kind of scary after rook to f2, and maybe rook g2, maybe rook f1, rook a1. It just feels a little bit dangerous. And with Wenjun having lost these games, she does not want to allow any counterplay whatsoever. So understandably, she plays rook e3. We got bishop to e4. Now she finally plays knight a2, but in this case, without the pawn on a4, while the knight is well placed on c3, there are less targets. We have rook b8 from Alireza. We get knight c3, rook b2, king e1, rook b3, and now Wenjun goes king f2. We have bishop h1, and now let's move knight to d1, rook b8, rook e5, trying to target the pawns on d5 and h5. We get the move g6, rook to e1 back, bishop to e4, and now knight to c3 is played. Here Alireza goes rook f8. We get king g1, and this move rook f3 is played. Now rook f3 is a big mistake, which does lose the game on the spot. Computer, for whatever reason, thinks that after king c6 here, black is maybe in the game, because if white were to take on e4, there's suddenly rook to e8 here with this pin. Black can take the knight, and computer actually thinks it's close to a draw. But Alireza goes rook f3, which also makes a ton of sense because he creates the kebab on the third rank, and after knight takes, pawn takes, king g2, Alireza assumes that this endgame with rook and 4 versus rook and 3 should be a draw, but as we're going to find out in the game, and even as the computer says here, black is completely lost. So Alireza goes rook d3, logical move, pressure both the pawns on d4 and g3 at the same time. We have king f2, c6 played here to stop white from ever pushing d5. Now we get king g2, rook d1, and king f3 is played. Now king g2 is a very nice nuance. This is what we call Zugzwang in classic Deutsch, also known as the German language. And what Zugzwang means is that you want to reach a position where you don't want to move, but your opponent also doesn't want to move. So here, if it's black's move, if it's white's move, black is completely fine, basically. But because it's black's move, black can't really keep the rooks from stopping the king from coming up by going to the side, because if you go rook a3, now white can go g4 here and try to trade off on the king side. And if you go rook d1 like Alireza plays in the game, now the king gets to f3, you break this rook idea from the rook being on the third rank, and after rook f1, king to e3, rook f7, Wenjun plays rook f4 here. Very, very good move, offering the trade of the rooks. Of course, with 4 pawns versus 3, black cannot trade the rooks. So we have rook g7, and now we get king d3 played here. Rook f6 also would have been very good, but she plays king d3 instead. Alireza plays king e6, and now we get this move rook to f8, a very nice move here. White has ideas like rook d8 and rook d6 here. There's also king to e4 to stop the king from getting to d5 or f5, and the game concludes after this move rook to a7. We get king to e4, rook to a1, rook to d8, and here Alireza Firouzja resigns the game. And the reason he resigns here is this move rook d6 with the classic bastion, as well as all the threats on the 6th rank, will be too much to handle. Sample line would be something like king e7, rook d6, let's say rook to a3, and after rook g6, you're guarding the pawn on g3. Black goes king f7, rook d6, and rook a3 here. After takes in this position, d5 check. Here takes. After rook c7, king f8, and d6. White's pawns are way too fast coming up the board here. Black's pawns are still very, very far away from the end of the board down here on this side near the h1 square, and so it's just hopeless, which is why Alireza resigns this game, and Wenjun gets a very, very big win over Alireza Firouzja, her first win in the tournament, and she does show that even if the female players are a little bit lower rated, they are still extremely dangerous, and if you don't take them seriously, bad things can happen. So moving on, now we have another game featuring a prominent female player in the challenger section. Now, the most obvious star in the challengers event is none other than Hans Niemann from the United States of America, someone who's made many brash claims, including that he's going to become the first American world champion, in spite of the fact that Bobby Fischer accomplished that over 50 years ago. Nonetheless, we have Hans Niemann playing with a black piece against a very talented Dutch player, Eline Roebers. Now, Eline Roebers is a player who's 17 years old. In the Women's World Cup, I believe it was in Baku, Azerbaijan, she won something like 8 games in a row. Very, very promising player, rated nearly 2400. She does have the IM title, if I'm not mistaken, as well, so not someone to be underestimated. But nonetheless, with Hans Niemann outranking her by 300 plus points, you're expecting Hans to show how great he is at chess. So without further ado, the game starts with e4. Hans plays c6, trying to play the Karo Khan. Now, one thing that's very tricky, no matter what the ratings are, is how do you try to win games with the black pieces against lower rated players who generally are very well prepared in the opening. So we get d4, d5 here from Hans, e5, bishop to f5. Now we have this old variation with bishop e3. Now I remember when I was quite a bit younger, I actually did play this line with bishop e3 quite a bit. I believe Gary Kasparov and Michael Adams were also playing it as well. The idea is white wants to play knight d2 next move. Let's say e6, knight d2, and now your bishop is very well developed on e3 towards both the diagonals. The knight on d2 can go to b3. You can also play c4 as well, and white has a very flexible position. So Hans plays queen b6 here, trying to pressure the pawn on b2. We get the move queen c1, e6, and now the move knight f3 is played. Hans plays knight e7. We get a4 here, and now he plays a5. Now, these a4, a5 maneuvers in the Karo Khan are very hard to understand. I would say in general, computers sometimes say you should play a4. Sometimes they say black should not play a5. Sometimes they say you should. Sometimes they say white shouldn't even play a4 at all. But nonetheless, we get a4, a5 being played. So now Eline Roebers plays knight bd2, Hans plays h6. We have the move bishop e2, bishop to h7 played, with the simple idea of bringing the knight to f5, pressuring the bishop on e3 as well as the pawn on d4, and then developing the bishop to e7 and castling on the queen side. One sample line, say castles, knight to f5, rook e1, bishop e7, pressure on the bishop and pawn, and you can castle out of the center of the board. And in the long term, you're going to use this light square bishop on the long diagonal as well. So Eline Roebers here plays the move knight to b3. Hans plays knight to a6 here. I assume Hans played knight a6 because he wanted to go knight b4 to pressure this pawn on c2 from a long distance. I think knight f5 was also playable, as was bishop e4, but knight a6 is what we see. Castles is played, and now Hans goes knight b4, putting pressure on the pawn on c2. Eline Roebers plays bishop to d1 to guard the pawn on c2 against the threats from the knight and the bishop. Hans plays knight to f5 here, and now we get this move bishop d2, and Hans plays bishop e7. After bishop e7, Eline Roebers plays this very strange move, knight to e1. Now, I suspect the reason she played this move is that there are many different setups in the Karo Khan, specifically the advanced, where if black plays g5, normally white brings this knight back to e1, and the idea is to maybe put the knight on d3 and c5, or put a bishop on d3 and trade off the light square bishops. So she plays knight e1 because she probably figures she can go c3 and knight d3. Also, black cannot capture the pawn because after takes c3, white forks the knight and the queen and will be up in material. So here Hans castles, and now we get the move c3, creating the classic connect 5, so should be game over on the spot. Hans play, oops, I didn't mean to do that. Sorry, you guys, I didn't mean to do that. Spoiler alert, spoiler alert, spoiler alert, you guys, I didn't mean to do that. I'm such an idiot. Anyway, let's keep going. So Hans plays knight to a6. He can't go to d3 because then there would be knight takes knight. We get knight to a6, and now we have the move knight f3 being played by Eline Roebers. Here Hans plays the move bishop to g6. We get this move h3, potentially supporting g4, but also creating the classic look for the king on the h2 square. Hans goes c5, and now we get pawn takes pawn, knight takes, and Hans now should be well on his way to a victory. Now obviously there's a little bit of spoiler which I didn't intend to show, so you're probably thinking, but Hans is great position, he's got this great bishop and queen lined up here on the diagonal, knight can go to g3, bishop can go to h5, or even come down the other way on the diagonal down the road. How can things possibly go wrong? So Eline Roebers plays bishop f4 here, which does stop the trick with knight g3. Hans plays rook a c8, we get bishop to e2, and now he plays this move d4. It's very, very clear that Hans is well on his way to a victory, because now the center is opening up. He's going to put the rooks on the c8 and the d8 squares, queen on b6, pressuring the pawn on b2, great pressure on the diagonal. How on earth can he not win? So Eline Roebers plays bishop b5, Hans goes rook f d8, very logical move. Now the rooks are on the two open files, and the rest should be a cakewalk. Eline Roebers plays queen e1, Hans trades on c3. Of course she takes with the pawn, not the queen, because then there's bishop takes f2 check, creating the classic fossil. And after rook takes bishop, rook takes queen, pawn takes, let's just say knight to e7 and knight d5, black should be winning the game. So here we have knight to e7 after the pawn capture. Eline Roebers goes queen e2, Hans goes knight d5. Hans has a great position here. He's got this great bastion with the knight on d5, the rook's on the two open files. He should just have zero risk whatsoever. So we get bishop d2, retreating the bishop, guarding the pawn, and avoiding the capture on f4. Hans plays rook c7, we get the move rook fc1 here. Now we have rook dc8 from Hans, trying to put pressure on the c file, and this is sort of the start of where he seems to be going a little bit wrong. Now it's very understandable that Hans figures with this knight on d5, very hard to create play on the d file. So if you can't create play on the d file, then most logically you want to stack the rooks and pressure the pawn on c3 and try to use the open c file. So we have knight e1 played again by Eline Roebers for the second time in the game with this retreat from the knight. This time it's a little bit more effective though, because what she would love to do is play bishop d3, trade the bishops, take with the knight, guard the pawn on f2 here, and then maybe go c4 or maybe rook a b1 and use the open b file. So Hans plays bishop to e7, we get the move queen to f3, he goes bishop g5 here, trying to remove one of the defenders of this pawn on c3 here by exchanging the dark square bishops. Eline Roebers trades the bishops, and now she plays rook to a3, desperately trying to hang on to this pawn on c3. Here Hans goes queen c5, and now she plays the move c4, queen guards the rook here, and the pawn threatens to maybe capture the knight on d5. Hans plays knight to e7 here with the idea of rerouting the knight to c6 and d4 potentially, or to f5 and d4 as well, and he's threatening to recapture, or not recapture, but capture this free pawn on e5 as well. So queen c3 played by Eline Roebers here, trying to guard the pawn, guard the rook, and maybe spy the pawn on a5 down the road. And also she intends to maybe go knight f3 and pressure the pawn on g5. So Hans plays bishop f5, we get knight to f3, now we have knight to d5 being played, and this is where things really start to get out of hand. After knight to d5, we have queen to b2, Hans goes knight f4, and now we have this move rook to d1. And while black is still very marginally better, the whole position and the game in general have really changed a lot in the last couple of moves. The reason for that is here white's bishop on b5 is actually very, very well placed. It guards the pawn on c4, pawns on a4 and c4 guard the bishop, which also means that black has a triple stack on the c file, but black actually cannot do anything here, and white now controls the only open file on the board, which is the d file. And when you combine that with the threats towards the pawn on g5 here, and the fact that down the road white can maybe even swing the rook over to g3, it's getting very, very tricky to play. So Hans plays queen to e7 here, which is a mistake. He probably should have played g4, but I understand why he didn't do it, because after takes and rook d4 here, computer says black has to play g5, and this just looks insane because all your heavy pieces are on this closed c file here, and it looks like white can maybe take down the road. Maybe white can even go like rook d2 and knight g5. These pieces look really, really loose here, and meanwhile you've got all these heavies which are doing nothing, and now your king is exposed on the g file as well. So Hans plays queen to e7, but now Eline Roebers plays rook to d6, and this rook is incredible. It's on the only open file, but it's also supported by the pawn on e5 here, and white is hoping to maybe create a double or a triple stack on the d file and capitalize in a major way. So Hans goes rook to d8 here, and this is a mistake. Again, the computer is screaming for g4, but as I mentioned before, after takes and rook d4, with g5 being the only move here, it looks so counterintuitive in terms of how you're trying to play as a human. Even though the computer says it's fine, it doesn't feel right intuitively to push your pawn, have these pieces here that feel very loose on the king side, and it's just not logical. So Hans plays rook to d8. Now we get queen to d2 from Eline Roebers, protecting the rook on d2, threatening to win the rook. Black cannot trade the rooks because then there's pawn takes rook, and the queen and the rook are forked here by this pawn on d6. So Hans goes rook c8, and now Eline Roebers plays c5. And this is sort of the chef's kiss kind of move. Now this rook on d6 is forever planted or this rook here is forever planted on d6 because it's supported by these two pawns. Black cannot capture c5 because you lose the rook, and if you ever trade here, probably white can take either way, but c takes d6, queen d8, and rook c3 takes, bishop covers the e2 square, and white's going to go d7 or queen c7 and simply win the game in a couple of moves. So Hans plays f6 here out of desperation, trying to weaken this grip of the rook on d6 by getting rid of one of the pawns that supports it. So we have bishop c4 played here, and now we get pawn takes pawn. Eline Roebers recaptures, and Hans goes king to h7 here, trying desperately to create counterplay. Here Eline Roebers plays rook to e3, which is a very good move, maybe not the absolute best move, but logical, as Hans has one big idea here. Let's say white were to play, I don't know, rook a2 for example. Black can maybe sack the rook, and after rook takes knight, now there's some counterplay. You've got a knight on f4, maybe queen c5, maybe somehow you can get something going on the e file, or maybe even sack on h3, and there are some practical hopes here in the position. But when Eline Roebers plays rook to e3, now rook c5 is no longer a move, because after rook takes rook, queen guards the rook, but the rook on e3 is a star as it guards its knight on e5. So here Hans plays the move knight to d5, and now Eline Roebers captures the knight, and Hans goes for a tactic with rook takes rook. Now this does not work, but I understand why he did it. Probably Hans thought that this position was so bad that he should try and trick her, confuse her in the complications, but it just doesn't work. Now if Hans were to capture the bishop on d5 here, which is the more natural move, white is knight to c6, forking the queen on the rook, pawn guards the rook on d6, and black is going to lose a lot of material. So Hans takes the rook, we get this trade, queen takes pawn, and temporarily it looks like maybe Hans has found a little bit of a trick here, because white cannot move the bishop away without losing the queen on d2, and if black can say capture on d5, then material is even once again, bishop and a knight here, and black is up a pawn and probably should be fine. So here Eline Roebers plays g4 though, attacking the bishop on f5, and now it's all for naught, because if black goes bishop b1 for example, there's bishop to e4 checking the king. Actually sorry, bishop e4 doesn't work. You go bishop e4, I think it's a draw, because black can sack the queen, go rook c1, and there's actually a repetition here with rook g1 and back and forth. But if you play bishop to b1 here, white can play this move queen to e1, hitting the bishop on b1 here and breaking the pin on the d file. Black captures after takes king h8 for example, white can simply go rook to e1. As long as there are no back rank threats here, white will win the game with this jumbo horse on e5. That being said, I do think it would have been a pretty reasonable try by Hans, hoping that Eline Roebers would fall for this trick where he could sack the queen, because in the game Hans plays rook c5 instead, and now after pawn takes bishop, rook takes bishop, and queen to e2, white has the queen and the rook guarding the knight. There's queen h5 coming, and any chance of a trick on the back rank is completely gone. So Hans takes the pawn on f5, we get the move queen h5, queen to h6. Eline Roebers plays queen to f7 here, attacking the pawn and the rook at the same time. Hans plays rook to d1, we get king to h2 here, a move which is simply dodging any checks on this light square diagonal should you go to g2. Hans plays f4, we get this move queen to f5, king to g8, and now this move queen c8. A simple repetition here to try and make Hans feel happy, but now after queen to c2, Eline Roebers is going to take this rook on d1, and with a knight on the board, technically speaking, there's nothing Hans can do. He goes king g8, we get rook to c3, which is fine. Queen takes rook is also completely winning after takes, queen b3, king h7, and queen e3 for example, but Eline Roebers decides to play rook c3, going on to finish this game in style with the idea of rook c8 checkmate. For example here, king has no squares available, the queen and the knight cover the two squares for the king. So Hans plays the move rook to d8, and now we get queen b3, king to h7, and Eline Roebers plays knight to f7, forking Hans's queen and rook here, and Hans resigns this game because there's really no hope. The last trick would be queen to h4, hoping for knight takes rook, where black can force a draw here with this repetition. But after queen to h4, white can simply check the king, guard the pawn, and when you move the king, I take the rook, queen guards the pawn, extra rook and knight, and black has no hope. So after knight to f7, Eline Roebers wins a very, very big game against Hans. I think she was struggling in this event. I do believe this was also her first win in the challengers section as well. So a very, very big win for her, a very, very big win for Wenjun, and a big win for the women who are proving that in spite of all the talk about how they can't compete with the men, they still are very dangerous players. And even if they might not win the event, you got to be very careful because they are very capable and they will spring some serious surprises if you're not ready. So a very, very rough day for Hans Niemann and Alireza Firouzja respectively as they lose their game state in the challengers and the masters section, but a great day for women's chess for sure. So on that note, I hope you guys have enjoyed this recap from round number 5 of the Tata Steel chess tournament being held in Wijk aan Zee in the country of the Netherlands. If you have not already subscribed to the channel, make sure that you smash that subscribe button below, and we'll be back soon with some more great YouTube only content. See you guys. Bye.